Okay, so moving on to lecture 10 of Rudolf Steiner's commentary to the Gospel of Matthew. Now Steiner begins to move very rapidly through the text and covers most of the midsection of it, going all the way down to the end of Matthew 17, which ends with the Transfiguration. So this is the midsection of the Gospel that he now begins to comment on. And he starts by saying that with regard to the healings that come after the Sermon on the Mount, these healings that take place, he says that indeed much ado has been made out of these healings. They're treated as miracles, and it's always emphasized their incredible nature. How could somebody do this? Obviously, it's impossible. But Steiner says it's not impossible because he says that there's an occult detail that is available to spiritual scientific investigation, in which one is able to see, not anatomically you can't see this, but through occult investigation you can, which is to say that back in the time of Christ, the human physical body was actually more pliable. It was actually looser, softer, and more pliable, whereas in today's society it is hardened up quite a bit. This process of stiffening has gone on and on over time. And Christ was the incarnation of the sun god, a being who came down, who was actually drawing down the powers of the sun, moon, and stars, drawing them down onto the earth, and with the power of his ego in place, whereas a healer in previous times would gain his clairvoyant vision and his ability to channel spiritual energies down to heal bodies through having participated in the mysteries, which would involve a suppression of his ego. Christ is able to do this not with the suppression of the ego because he hasn't been through the mysteries. He's making them public as a historical event for the first time, and he is able to channel these energies into these spiritual healings. Indeed, the name Jesus means healer. It's the Greek version of Joshua, which means healer, a spiritual healer. So that to the writer of the Matthew Gospel, Steiner says he wasn't recording miracles wasn't anything particularly special, since individuals who were talented healers during that time could do things like this, could heal physical bodies with spiritual powers. But the emphasis in this chapter in this lecture is Christ bringing down these cosmic powers, streaming down to him and then streaming into his disciples, and that the disciples then would have two different modes of experience of him. And this gets into Steiner's idea here in this chapter of the day Christ and the nocturnal Christ. There are two modes of experience of him. The disciples have these two modes of experience of him. In the daytime, they realize that he is the incarnation of the sun, and he has all this amazing power. They participate in it, and it flows to them, and they're even able to perform a number of healings and exorcisms and so forth. But during the night, when they had gone to sleep, and their astral bodies would have separated from their physical and etheric bodies, and they would have gone into the astral plane, they would have been able to have a certain amount of clairvoyance insofar as they could actually see during that period into the future and see coming events that would transpire. And so Steiner moves to a discussion of the miracle of the loaves and fishes, which is repeated twice, both in the Mark Gospel and in the Matthew Gospel. So it's not likely that it's a mistake or that it's just a mere repetition. The 5 loaves feed the 5,000, and then we have a page or so later we have 7 loaves of fish feeding the 4,000. And then after each of these two events occurs an epiphany of Christ. In the first one, in his nocturnal mode as the nocturnal Christ who walks upon water, and in the second one in his day mode as the sun god who appears as the transfigured Christ on the mount. And so the numbers of these loaves, that in the first case there are 5 loaves and 2 fishes, and then in the second case that there are 7 loaves, and we're not told how many fishes, just a few. Those numbers 5 and 7 add up to 12. That's not an accident. Of course, that refers to the 12 signs of the zodiac then. And the fact is that during the nighttime, when the sun goes on its daily course during the nighttime, it traverses 5 of the zodiacal constellations. And during the daytime, it traverses through the other 7. So that the appearance of the nocturnal Christ, and he appears during the 4th watch of the night, right after he feeds and this is it's spiritual food. This is the food that Christ is drawing down from the cosmos to feed to the thousands. The 5 loaves are fed to 5,000, which Steiner refers to, and this part may or may not be right because his spiritual diagram of history is so idiosyncratic, but he says it refers to the 5th post-Atlantean epoch, and the feeding of the 7 loaves to the 4,000 refers to the 4th. This epoch, this Greco-Roman epoch that they're in at this point with the 7-day constellations. So these 5 night constellations take place, and then we see the nocturnal Christ walking on water. The 4th watch of the night is between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. And so here he is. This is the nocturnal sun. This is the sun on its night sea journey through the night. Then, and that is in, let's see, that's Matthew 14. And then in Matthew 15, the next page, we get the manifestation to the 4,000, to the 4th epoch, whereas the 5,000 would have been to our epoch, the 5th, the age of the consciousness soul. So to the 4,000 with 7 fish, and these would be the 7 signs that the sun goes through during the daytime. This then is followed in the next chapter, or in chapter 17 actually, by the Transfiguration. So the Transfiguration, it specifically says in this version of the Transfiguration that Christ's face, when he goes up onto the mount, shines like the sun. This is his daytime manifestation as the sun god. But it's also a shift into an ascent, according to Steiner, into the realm that is above the astral plane for him, namely Divashan. And he says, and so note that he takes up the 3 disciples, which are his 3 favorites, of course, Peter, James, and John, and they are 3 of the original 4 that he first picked, Simon Peter and his brother Andrew. And note, too, that when these men are crucified, Peter is crucified in 67 A.D. Paul dies the same year, by the way. This must be during the heat up into the First Romano-Jewish War that ends in 70 with the destruction of the temple. And Peter is crucified upside down, and then his brother Andrew is crucified in Greece on a cross in the shape of an X, and he's simply tied to it rather than having nails punctured through him. So the first 2 disciples that he picks meet similar fates to him. And then we have James and John. James, I think, becomes later the patron saint of veterinarians and equestrians and pharmacists. John actually becomes John the Evangelist because he's the youngest of the 12. And I think both James and Andrew were initially members of the John the Baptist's religion. So there's a reason why Christ has selected them, specifically them. He recognizes 2 of them from his period, perhaps when he was with John the Baptist. So he takes them up. They go up onto the mound, and and then Christ sort of carries them up into Divashan, where he then sees, the 3 of them see Christ in the center with Elijah and Moses beside him. Now Elijah, of course, was reincarnated as John the Baptist, and this takes place, as Steiner says, at a point in the narrative after the death of the Baptist, so that his ego/soul, for Steiner the ego is the soul, is already in Divashan. It's on the other side, so that the disciples then can see the apotheosis here, this transfiguration of Christ in discussion with Moses and Elijah. And then Steiner concludes this lecture by talking about how now the forces that Christ would have made manifest within the earth will go on into the future bearing fruit that will be available to us, bringing this Christ being down into the earth, which becomes united with the earth. He appears only once in the physical body on the physical plane to the disciples who see him physically, whereas to Paul actually sees him on the road to Damascus in etheric form. But this etheric vision is what will be made available to us gradually. Steiner says we will be able to perceive the Christ being etherically more and more over time, and also more and more of these energies will be available to human beings as they undergo further and further incarnations, and the powers of the Christ will come into their incarnations to help them to develop naturally into these higher 3 faculties of the spirit self, the life spirit, and the spirit man or spirit body. And so then Steiner concludes by saying that Jesus ben Pandira was the Essene, as we have discussed, who about 100 years before Christ was pointing the way to him, was 100 years before him, and was saying, one who will come in physical form, who will bring the ego, the sun being down, and in full ego consciousness, make what previously was available only to the esoteric few in the mysteries available to everyone. And Steiner says, if Jesus of Pandira were to be reincarnated today, he would make a similar prophecy, only he would prophesy that the one who is to come will be, the Christ being will now be made available to us in etheric form, the etheric Christ, the same Christ that Paul saw, in contradistinction to the physical Christ that was witnessed by the disciples. And so that brings us up to lecture 10. And so we have 2 more lectures left to go, and we're on chapter 13 of the Gospel of Matthew.